What's that? Yeah. How you doing? Good. You're doing great.
Hi folks, how's everybody doing tonight? Nice to see you, thank you. This is a great turnout. Actually, I was a little bit nervous because as we get into the spring, a lot of other things come to the surface in terms of what you could be doing on a Tuesday night. And I'm just very happy to see you all here, so thank you so much for being here. My name is Leah Peterson. I'm from the Bell Museum, as many of you know, and I serve as the Adult Programs Coordinator there. And I just want to give a shout out to a couple of special guests in the audience tonight, my fiance Sean and my soon-to-be stepdaughter Christiana Lily. Thanks guys. They only get to go out once a year on a Tuesday night, so I wanted to make them special. Make them feel special. Alright, so a little bit of housekeeping tonight. We have one more regular season Cafe Scientifique, which is happening on May 16th. It's the third Tuesday of May. And the topic is biomimicry with Associate Professor and Director of the Snell-Ruud Lab at the University of Minnesota. Her name is Dr. Emily Snell-Ruud. So that'll be a great one. We're very excited. I've actually been working with Emily for a couple of years now to hopefully be able to bring her in for a cafe, and our schedules are finally working out. So we're very happy to have her. And let's see, we have a number of, we have a number of quiz questions that are going to come up in just a second, but I wanted to mention that if you do have questions regarding the topic tonight, as the speaker is speaking, Dr. Lang, Jeff has invited you to please feel free to ask questions during the talk. The caveat being that if you raise your hand, I will come over to you with the microphone so we can hopefully get your voice on tape for our podcast. Podcasts are available for free with University iTunes. We have over 60 of them now, I think. So if you go to the Bell Museum website and Cafe Scientifique activity, and then you click on the Go to Podcasts button, you can have access to this and a whole number of other podcasts. And Kyle, are you set up to do video casts tonight too?
Yep.
Excellent. And we're also adding these to video with the slides and the talk synced up together up to our YouTube channel for the Bell Museum as well. So check that out. And then finally, just a quick note, there's a bathroom at the very back of the theater here. It's easy to get to without having to go out into the bowling alley. So please feel free to check that one first, potentially. It gets kind of noisy sometimes when those doors swing open, but you also have to walk quite a ways through the crowd to get over to the bathrooms over here, so it might just be easier on you as well. Without further ado, I want to get to the quiz. So Erin, if you could come up and join us. Thank you. Keeper of the prizes. This is Erin Hoffmeister. Many of you know that he's been volunteering for every single Cafe Scientifique and Bell Social for over 5 years now, which is pretty amazing. but he works at the Seward Co-op Friendship Store on 38th, if you ever want to go visit him at his other job, when he gets paid for it. All right.
Be there tomorrow.
They'll be there tomorrow. Okay, so question number 1. Obviously, our topic is crocodiles and alligators tonight. Number 1. This is multiple choice, so please wait till you hear all the options before you raise your hand. Do not shout out the answer, or you will be disqualified. Okay? Everybody got it? Excellent. What's our first prize, Aaron?
I was thinking.
Excellent. So we have, this is spinal tape. It's packaging tape with a spine on it and a couple of wonderful spring flowers to plant pretty soon. Primrose and mixture.
Yeah, in a mixture.
Excellent. All right. Number 1. Which of the following differences between alligators and crocodiles is true? So 3 are false, 1 is true. A. Alligators are endotherms, while crocodiles are ectotherms. B. Alligator meat is edible, but crocodile meat contains tetrodotoxin, the same lethal neurotoxin as pufferfish. C. Alligators are found in the wild all over the world, while crocodiles are found only in the US and China. Or D. Alligators have shorter, wider, more U-shaped heads, while crocodile snouts are longer and more V-shaped. I gotta go with Hannah right there. D? That is correct. Well done. Good job, Hannah. Alright, no more nepotism, I promise. I legitimately, her hand went up at the same time as everybody else's. Alright, question number 2, and we will discover what the prizes are momentarily. I'll read the questions first, so. Alright, have you picked it out? No, you can grab something else. Well, those are kind of special. You can grab something else too. Perfect.
Okay.
All right. Prize number 2 is a set of evolution bookmarks, and a set of the original Viewmaster slides of the dioramas, which you can still get Viewmasters on Amazon, by the way. So you can actually, and other places like eBay, so you can check it out.
Yeah, antique store.
Antique store, yes. And then a poster of a vintage diorama, the museum diorama. All right, postcard. Right. Okay, number 2. In a 2013 paper, biologists reported observing tool use in American alligators in the U.S. and mugger crocodiles in India. What were these tools, and what were they being used for? A. Crocs and gators were partially submerging themselves near bird rookeries with sticks balanced across their snouts, baiting herons and egrets collecting sticks for nest building into the perilous snack zone. B. Crocs and gators were laying eggs in hollow trees underwater, then ripping bark from the tree and chewing it into the shape of a ball to manufacture a plug to plug any of the holes in the hollow tree. C. Crocs and gators were breaking off sponges and wearing them over their snouts to protect their nasal passages from debris while foraging for fish burrowing in the substrate. And D. Crocs and gators were adorning themselves with found feathers and trash in order to attract their mates. Stanley. A is correct, yes. According to this paper, Crocs and gators were observed in these 2 different places, putting sticks on their noses in bird rookeries, and tempting the birds to come kind of collect the sticks, and then that was the end for the birds. All right, question number 3 is a true or false question. We have, let's see, macaroni and cheese adhesive bandages, and, oh, they kind of go together. All right. And Mounds flavored chapstick. I got these are some of the leftover things from Axeman. So I can't guarantee the safety of any of them. Sure, give them one more. And a little dolphin corpus. I think it's a focus. All right, excellent. Beanie Baby type thing?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, a stress reliever.
Yep.
Oh, excellent. All right, so true or false? The muscles used by crocodiles to open their jaws are so weak they can be held shut by an adhesive bandage or a person using just one hand. True or false? Yes.
True.
That is true. Correct. Very good. Very good. All right, just 2 more questions today, okay? Number 4. Oh yeah, let's give it.
This one?
Yeah. So this
More flowers.
and some more flowers. Perfect. So we're moving on Thursday to St. Paul, and museum is moving to St. Paul, but I'm also personally moving to St. Paul, and I was thinking that in the tradition of Kevin Williams, who of course was here for many years, clearing out his office piece by piece by way of trivia prizes, I could bring in a couple of items from my move. And actually, most of the good ones are in boxes, so it's going to have to be next month. But this is a little thing I picked up somewhere in Washington State that's been traveling with me for 20 years. So enjoy. I don't know. It's kind of like a little green man face. It's a paperweight. I think
It's an M&M. Knick-knack.
a knick-knack, a tchotchke. All right, number 4. Of the 20 to 80 eggs female crocodiles lay in a single clutch, what percentage are likely to hatch successfully and survive the first year of life? And I just want to say I got this from one source. There were a few different, interpretations of what that percentage might actually be. But okay, A, 99% survival. B, 55%. C, 25%. Or D, 1%. Lily. So close, Lily. Good call. One guess, but I promise I'll give you one of my tchotchkes when we get home. All right, back. 1% is correct, yes. So closer to 1%. Some of the estimates were closer to 20%. As many as 99% of hatchlings are eaten by large fish, monitor lizards, and in a twist of, ironic justice, herons. So the adults are eating the herons and the herons are eating the babies. Works out. And also they're eaten by adult crocodiles. And if you have different stats on that that you want to share, please feel free.
So who is Eric?
It's honestly, is it carved in there or written on there? I think it was probably a shop project for some, high school kid that ended up on the thrift store. All right, what are we at? Looks like a journal and a little deck of, little reference card deck of guarded insects of the North Woods. Very timely. Excellent. Maybe you should throw some seeds in.
Yeah.
Perfect. If there are any left.
No, there's
Oh, excellent. All right, last question for tonight. Crocodiles share a 240 million year old common ancestor with their closest living relatives, the blank. Is their closest living relative A, pythons, B, sea turtles, C, mice, or D, birds? Right along the edge there. Yep, you. Birds is correct. Excellent. Thank you. Awesome. Thanks, Erin. All right. So by way of introduction tonight, I just have a little bit of background information about our speaker, Dr. Lang. He did his undergrad at the University of Michigan and visited the Itasca Field Station for a number of summers to do projects up there. So he was making his way westward into Minnesota and eventually North Dakota for education, and then earned his PhD from the University of Minnesota in 1977. His studies were performed in South Florida, but one of the reasons that he went into studying crocodiles and alligators is because of a tropical biology course he took from Dr. Frank Barnwell, who's also here in the audience tonight. So he told me that in the Bell Museum, the one that we're currently packing up and moving, there was a time when his project alligators were kept in the toilets. In the touch and see room. In swimming pools, actually, not actually in the toilets like everybody's worst crocodile nightmare. And then they were moved into their special tanks that they had for the touch and see. He did his postdoc work in Australia for several years and taught with his wife Gretchen, who's also here tonight, who is an anthropologist at the University of North Dakota. And yes, one of the very important things that he's worked on over the years that may come up tonight, but is not specifically the topic, was the temperature determination of the sex of eggs of crocodiles. So, whether they were hatched to be female or male, depending on what temperature they were kept at when they were incubated, and that being determined in some way biologically by the hatching mother, I guess. Yeah. Is it? Well, okay. Oh, just the temperature. So she didn't make any kind of decision about whether to worm it or cool it necessarily. Interesting. I didn't know. All right. Well, excellent. I just want to bring Jeff up here to get started with his talk. So thank you very much. Please welcome Dr. Lane to Cafe Scientifique.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming out tonight. And I want to tell you a little story about sort of a passion of mine. When I meet someone and they sort of say, well, what are you doing? Why are you going to India? And I try to explain that I'm kind of like a bird watcher, except that I'm actually studying reptiles, which is what I've been doing for quite a long time. Not only did we look at sex determination in alligators and crocodiles, alligators here in the U.S. and crocodiles in Australia, but we also looked at sex determination in some of the turtle species. So I've ended up spending a lot of time looking at long-lived reptiles, some of which are quite big. And the story that I'm going to tell tonight really revolves around quite a series of sort of accidental encounters. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago if I intended to spend as much time in India as I have, I probably would have said there's no way that could have happened. But I'll go ahead and start the story, and I do invite you to just interrupt as we go along. So the gharial is a very unusual crocodile. So one of the main take-home messages that I want to convey is not all crocodiles sort of lurk around near billabongs and pull people out of tents. So there's some very big reptiles, and they do some very, very subtle things. So I hope one of the things that you might go away with tonight is the idea that some of these large reptiles are very interesting and probably do provide some sort of a window on what many of the other reptiles and reptile relatives may have done. And as we're learning, we didn't know a lot of the information that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is another sort of title slide. There are actually almost 300 babies. And in the middle is a 5-meter male. The male is distinguished. It's the only crocodile species in which you can tell the males and the females apart by an actual distinctive feature, and that is the development of this large gara in the male. And this thing is really big. It's about the size of a pot. And in fact, the name gara is a Hindi word for pot, the small style of pot. And this is almost the size of a gara of a 5-meter crocodile. And I'll just take a minute here just so that we know exactly how big a 5-meter crocodile is.
Where on the crocodile is the gara?
Pardon?
Where on the crocodile?
It's right on the tip of the snout. So this is one of the ones I'll show you that we put a radio on. Whoops, wait, okay, 15 feet, 16 feet, 17, there we are, right there. So this was the size of one of the animals that I'll be talking about. I'll just leave this out here so that hopefully it won't turn around. So the gara is right here. It's on the end of its nose. And actually, it's essentially a series of folds. It's a cartilaginous structure that the air actually goes through, and then it exits out the back. And so when he breathes, he actually sort of blows air toward his eyes. And we don't really know what the function of this gara is, but hopefully I'll give you some clues. So the other take-home, I think, is that we've had really, really strong support from the zoo community, both in the U.S. as well as the international zoos. One of our main supporters has been the City Council of Prague, because the Prague Zoo is actually owned by the people of Prague, and they have supported us to the tune of around $10,000 to $15,000 a year for the last 3 or 4 years. And this has been very, very major and important and significant. And it's the zoos that primarily are supporting the kind of work we're doing, which is very qualitative, descriptive, you might call it natural history. But I think it's really key to understanding some of the things we need to know to make good conservation decisions. So this is the animal. It's a very unusual animal. We talked a little bit about alligators and crocodiles, and those are really a good series of questions. Gharial are in a third group, and they're the only species of that group living. But there's a very extensive evolutionary record. For instance, there used to be big gharials in South America, in Central America, even in Florida. And so it's a group that's been around for a long time, but today the only surviving member of the group is this one species. They have very big eggs. The eggs are almost 3 times bigger than an average alligator or average crocodile egg. They have very long snouts. They begin eating fish almost within a week to 10 days after hatching. I would call them very precocial. They begin swimming upstream against the current right away within a couple of weeks. They live in groups. And the groups of the babies are usually accompanied by adults. So there are only about 2,500 gharial globally surviving. They used to be extend all the way from western Iran all the way through Burma. But today the main populations are in India, and there's one small population in Nepal. So the total number we estimate is around 2,500. These are not hatchlings, but this would be adults and juveniles. And by far, 80% or so of the entire world's population is on the Chambo River. Now, the Chambo River is a real sort of no man's land. It's essentially the home of bandits, dacoits. It has a very checkered history in North India. And there was a film made in the 80s, The Bandit Queen, and I just wanted to show a little segment of that. So this is the terrain. This is incredibly steep, high banks on one side. There are people that actually live along the river. They take all their water, their drinking water, all the water for their livestock out of the river. And the river is essentially inaccessible all the time.
प्रभारी की जरूरत अब है अम्मा बूढ़ी हो गई घर के काम काज नहीं हो पावत
And people make a living along the river. This is a really interesting town that I would like to look it up and watch. It's a very interesting story about a woman who became a very infamous bandit in this area. So the Chambo is sort of known. The one thing about the Chambo is it essentially is unholy. Essentially takes its name from thousands of cows that were killed and the river ran blood, and so that may actually be one of its saving graces. It's also the only really large protected river system, and this is in North India. And there are three main states: Madhya Pradesh, which is where most of the tigers are in India, some 300 or more. Rajasthan, which extends over into semi-arid and desert area, and the state of Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh is the size of Minnesota. They just had an election. There are 230 million people. The density is about 500 people per square kilometer. So this is one of the largest and densest concentrations of people in the world, and certainly in India. There are a lot of neat animals. This is one of the hard-shelled turtles. It's an herbivore, the red-crowned roof turtle. There are two species of soft-shelled turtles that get almost a meter across. They're huge. They're carnivorous. The mugger crocodile occurs in habitats with the gharial, but tends to not be as numerous. But within 5 kilometers of the place where we stay, a couple of years ago, a little 10-year-old boy was taken by a mugger. So they still are definitely pose problems to the people living on the river. There's a very unique dolphin, freshwater dolphin, the Gangetic dolphin, almost blind, and a wide variety of birds. This is a huge river. It's sort of similar to the Mississippi, but during the monsoon it floods about 30 feet, and it has an expanse almost like the Mississippi. So this enormous basin fills up and essentially gets flushed out every monsoon. These are Indian skimmers. They're known only from a few places. And so what brought me to the Chambo was the fact that there were all these gharials there. But the gharial, it sort of had a double whammy in the mid to late 2000s. It was uplisted to critically endangered on the basis of the fact that the numbers of animals had been steadily declining up until about 2004 or 5. And then in the winter of 2007 and 8, there was a mass mortality of at least 100 2 to 4 meter gharial. And no one really understood what this was all about. It was in December, January, and February. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But that actually opened the door, so to speak. One of the problems with working in South Asia, and particularly India, is that there's a real strong status quo mentality. And that is, especially when it comes to working on some of these animals, doing things like catching the animals and attaching tags to them, for instance, because there is a risk associated with that. And any risk usually implies someone has made some mistakes. And so it was easier just to simply not take the risk on the chance that an animal would be killed, especially these animals that are endangered. But when so many animals died, the forest departments in the 3 states, and they're the ones that have jurisdiction, actually allowed some research to take place. Now, what we wanted to do is find out really what this mass mortality meant in terms of the total population. So we wanted to get some idea of how healthy the population was. We wanted to find out more about what the animals were doing, and that would hopefully tell us a little bit more about possibly the causes and consequences of the die-off. And then eventually the idea was to come up with some kind of recovery plan or conservation plan for the species. And we tried to focus on 2 key elements. One was just what did an individual animal need in order to make a living through its lifetime. So we wanted to know how it used space and how that related to the seasons and from year to year. And then the other key element, of course, with these reptiles, especially these long-lived reptiles like crocodilians and turtles, is related to one of the questions at the beginning here, and that is that many, many young are produced, but only a few survive. And so understanding something about the reproductive biology was important. So we used some standard techniques, and I'll show you a little bit about that, but you can see here we caught animals. Here you can see a radio on the tail mounted on the dorsal surface. We caught animals using nets, and then we tracked them with telemetry. And we were fortunate that I had previously worked with turtles in Minnesota and Nebraska, working with ATS, which is a company that has its origins at the University of Minnesota at Cedar Creek. And we've had a very productive relationship working with that telemetry. It's a world-renowned telemetry company doing for wildlife tracking. So we put radios on animals, partly just to find out how animals were using the river and how they were moving around. And we used those individual animals, which we kept close track of, as indicators of what the whole population was doing. And we started, we had kind of a rocky start in 2008 because the monsoon started, so we only had 1 animal tagged. And then we tagged 9 more in 2009, but we did this during the breeding season, so this was really not the time to do it. So we learned our lesson, and from then forward, we caught animals post-monsoon in November and December, and we tagged some additional animals, so we could keep track of each animal for about a year to a year and a half to 2 years. And actually, I was surprised when we finally added this up. We initially targeted the 2 to 4 meter sized animals. Those are the ones we wanted to keep track of because those are the ones that died during the die-off. But as we went on, it became obvious that we needed to learn more about what the bigger animals were doing. So I'm going to just give you some of our experiences here. This was the 2013. We were able to get a couple of larger animals, including this junior male. And we learned our lesson slowly but surely. It's not too easy to handle these animals. And one of the things we learned is we need to stabilize the front of the animal and not take such risks when we're releasing animals. So from this point onward, we put a stick in next to the snout, and the snout was usually tied, and then we released the snout. And then the problem here was that everyone got off on the count of 1 instead of 3. Except Monsami, who was the crack expert from the Madras Crack Bag. He stayed on the front, but it was a little dicey. So this animal had 2 tags, 1 on the neck and 1 on the tail. And here you'll see, so the problem with gharial that we found early on was that you can't trap them, which you can do with most other crocodiles. You can put a piece of meat in a trap, you can make a trap out of netting, and you can set it, and eventually a crocodile will go in the trap and get caught. But the problem with gharials are they're fish eaters, and so you have to actually net them. But the problem with netting them is they're really good at avoiding nets, and if they get to be 3 meters and then 4 meters and bigger, they get to be experts at crossing nets and essentially evading nets. So we had to do some very complicated net sets. And as you can see, we had an experienced team of catchers, and they got better and better as time went on. Actually, what you can't see is how happy they are that they got a really big animal. And they knew that it was reasonable. These are fishermen, so they have to deal with these animals. And often, the easy way to deal with a gharial if you're a fisherman is you just take an axe and chop its snout in half, which sounds really horrible, and usually is. But these fishermen became very, very good at catching gharial. And this happened to be an animal that we caught and we tracked when it was 2 meters long and it weighed 35 kilos, and 5 years later we caught it and it was 4 meters and we think it weighed about 10 times as much. We weren't able to weigh some of these really big animals in the field. But the guys that are working are pretty good at carrying 50 kilo and 100 kilo grain sacks, so we think we have a pretty good estimate. Anyway, the problem with these really big animals is just that they're really huge, and they don't really struggle very much. They don't have much stamina. They get very tired, but they're just unbelievably heavy and awkward to move around. Everyone was quite delighted. This is the big male. And I just included this because you can see. So this is its snout. And this is this big lump of cartilage, which essentially is folded multiple times. And we think acts as sort of a resonator when the animal breathes. Here you can get a better idea of how large the animal was. And so I want to focus now on some of the reproductive aspects, because those were really some of the most surprising, and some of the things that really distinguish this gharial from some of the other crocodilians. First of all, the animals nest during the dry season. They don't make a mound nest like alligators and some of the crocodiles. They actually dig a hole in the sand, more like some of the turtles that you might be familiar with. They nest together in colonies, and then the nests they nest at the same time, and then the nests all hatch more or less at the same time. So there's synchronous hatching. And then, unlike any of the other crocodilians, they stay together in a big group. So all the babies, instead of going off with mama in one direction and another direction, which is what most of the other crocodiles do, and alligators, they form a larger and larger group, or creche. And a number of females are usually involved in attending these creches. So here you'll see, this is a female coming up to open her nest. We find the nest by simply going and patting on the sand, and within 2 or 3 days of hatching, you can hear the young in the nest. They're calling, oh, 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 oh. And the volume of the calling is related to how many babies have hatched. So here's a female digging up her nest. And here's some babies here. There's an eye shine, another eye shine, and here's some young that have just come out. And if you notice, the baby comes out of the egg and then almost instantly gets sort of hurled out of the nest.
How long are the babies out of the eggs but in the sand?
They probably can hatch a day, 2, 3 days, but they're 16 to 20 inches down in the sand. And it's very unlikely that they would be able to dig their way to the surface, for instance. It probably requires the female to open the nest. There's enough air. Good question, though. So here's some young in a nest, and you can just barely see at the top here. There's some eggshells, but this is actually the shoreline. So there's a whole group of young that have already hatched, and what happens is the young simply walk from the nest down to the water. So this is probably the only crocodilian that doesn't do this mouth transport, where they pick up the babies one at a time, or a mouthful of babies, and carry them down to the water, like alligators do and most of the other crocodiles. So there's essentially a reception committee at the water. Here are a couple of adults, and all these are eye shines of babies, probably from 2 or 3 nests that have already hatched, ready to greet the animals that have just hatched from a nest. Now this is a backwater. The main channel of the river is on the other side, over near these trees. And there were 3 nests, and then a 4th nest. This is the one that most recently hatched. And this is where all the young are. So here's the female, and some of the young. You can see they're only a few days old. They have quite a bit of yolk yet. And in this case, I was sitting on the bank observing and filming, and one of the local shepherds came and said, basically, this is when I do my laundry, I take my bath, I say my prayers, any problem? And he didn't have any problem with the gharial over here, and the gharial didn't have any problem with his doing his thing on this side of the river. And I didn't have any problem with either of them, so. Here's another situation where a female has come over. These are young from 2 clutches. And what happened in this situation is that there were 2 large river terns that were dive bombing the babies, and they scattered the young into the water. And the female was actually out in mid-river and came over to where the young were. Whoops. And then she leapt up. About 2/3 out of the water toward the terns in an effort to try to protect the young.
Did it work?
Yeah, it worked. Eventually the babies came out basking and the terns left. This is a woolly-necked stork, so some of these large wading birds also are main predators. You can see the way the young have moved away here. And here, you can see there's some young from 2 clutches along the shoreline. This is just a still, and this is a woolly-necked stork. And this is what happened. So these avian predators are really significant, especially during the daytime. And the fact that they're adults attending to the young makes a difference. The females stay with the young at night. So here's a female emerging. You can see a fish in the water. So we did a lot of game camera work, and we're continuing to do that. So these young are just a couple days old, and they're at the water's edge. And so you can see, literally, there are hundreds of babies. And the interesting thing is that even though there are 10, 15, 20 females sometimes associated at these nesting colonies, only a couple females are the main dominant females that come in to take care of the young. They seem to take turns, but there is definitely some sort of a dominance hierarchy. But they don't stay next to the babies all day or all night. They come and go. So this is just a video, a time lapse And you can see the time here. So now it's 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. And you can see the female comes in 10 o'clock, midnight. So the female comes and then she goes. And the young sort of spread out. Sometimes they're on her back. 4 o'clock in the morning. And then it gets light, and you can see how tight the group is now during the day. So there must be some advantage in not being dispersed and dispersing at night. So the young all hatch at one time. They form these really large groups. The females are sort of more or less on routine attendance. But if there's a major disturbance, usually the females will retreat back to mid-river, and a guardian male associated with the nesting side of the creche will come in and defend the young. And this is one of the rare times that you see the males, because they're very good at sort of avoiding being around. So this is just a male, sort of a close-up view. He happened to pose right in front of one of the game cameras. And you can see here's the Gara on the tip of his snout. You can see he's got essentially just a narrow bone for his lower jaw, and same thing on the upper jaw and the skull. And then here's the gullet. And here's another male that came out, and you can see how close he is. Here's the microphone, here's the lens of my camera, here's a sun umbrella. And he came out literally almost into my lap. And we sat there for 2 hours, and then I got up with an iPhone and I was going to do a panorama, and at that point he just turned around and went racing back into the water. But during that 2 hours we were sitting quietly, the young came out and they started to crawl on his tail, and he was just simply there. He was just stationary next to the young. Now this is still, you can see this was a place where we had 30 nests that hatched, so this is a large group of young. We actually had two groups, a very large group and a smaller group. And if you approach one of these groups, what happens is the females will usually retreat back to mid-river, and the male will come from either downstream or upstream. He's not necessarily right there, but he responds fairly quickly. So now this is the video. You can see the young are moving around. And the male has come in and then positions himself literally between us as we approach and now you can hear what it sounds like when the animals breathe through this car. It's actually much louder than this when you're actually in the river. Take my word for it. But so part of the function of that Gara is to sort of make this breathing, accentuate the breathing, and make that very audible for the animals, for anybody in the vicinity. This is another display. Whoops. Yeah. And here's a male at night with young. You can see young are sort of totally all over his body. And here's a male early in the morning. A much more subtle display, and then the young vocalize a little bit. Here's some crows fly over, and the young go scurrying into the water. And initially, during some of our, the first years when we were making observations, we just sort of sit quietly, and this is what would happen. The young would begin to come out, they begin to bask, and the male is simply there in attendance, without doing a lot of displaying. And then the young respond in this way.
Question over here.
Yep.
How many teeth do they? The average teeth.
They have 110 teeth. Yeah.
Okay. Lily, go ahead and then we'll.
All right. Let me just let me hang on.
The question is, are they friendly?
Are they friendly? I don't know if I'd call any crocodiles friendly, but they definitely get used to regular activities on the river that people engage in. They take their goats down, they water their cattle, they do their laundry, they take a bath. Gharial are fish eaters, and they just simply don't pose any particular problem to people. The only time that you might have a difficult time and when they might not be friendly is if you were holding one of the babies and the baby was vocalizing. And that's what we're doing here. What's been happening behind me is what we did was we recorded the vocalizations and just played them through a little speaker. We have a little, one of these suction shower speakers, you know, that you can move it around. And so we played the vocalization of a baby that was being held, presumably being threatened, and the male came right in. And you can see from the way it moved around, we had a microphone here because we didn't know if it was going to vocalize or make any sounds, but you could see it came in and it just sort of moved around the microphone. We thought it might bite the microphone. It never did anything like that. All it did was just sort of nose around very inquisitively. The males stay around with the young for about 4 to 6 weeks, but they're most attentive during the first couple of weeks when the young are really small. And if there's any kind of sort of multiple threats, in this particular case there were people that came down to the river and there was a pond heron on the other side, so both the male and the female came and guarded the creche, essentially, in this case. And there was another instance in which there were some kites that were threatening a clutch of young. And here's the male. This is the male's gara and his eyes. And the female with some young on her head. Anyway, both parents came in and essentially were both present to confront the potential predators. And so the people get used to the animals on the river, and so here's one of these large males, and here you can see a grandfather is just taking a bath, and there's a little 3 or 4-year-old boy that comes out of the water, and there's a woman doing her laundry in the back, and in a minute she'll sort of emerge with a sari, and all of this sort of just goes on without people being too concerned. People do distinguish between Gharial and the mothers, which do pose a threat. So in addition, the very unusual thing about Gharial, again, is that the males are so heavily involved in the parental care, or the guarding, and this is not really. There are examples in some of the other crocodile species of males behaving in a protective manner, but nowhere near to the extent that is evident in the Gharial. And then we have a couple of instances of what we think is guarding behavior by animals that we don't think are the parents. And I'll give you a couple of the examples. This is that animal that we tagged. and it only had a little tiny Gara, and we know it wasn't involved in any breeding. But yet it was the main guardian for 2 years at one of the creches that had the first year 10 nests and the second year closer to 15 nests. So it was the guarding male, but it was not the breeding male in that area. Their breeding, the breeding males set up essentially breeding arenas or territories, and it's very obvious which males are doing most of the breeding. So this male was not, but the third year, this male became one of the breeding males, and actually had a breeding area near the nesting site, which he also was guarding.
So is there some sort of pay your dues situation going on?
Yeah, I think what I think is happening is that we essentially have some apprenticing. And what happens in these situations at the creches is the males and females have to communicate in some way, and they have to coordinate the protection of the young. And that may afford some of the younger males with opportunities to become familiar with the experienced nesting females and give them an advantage in future years when they aspire to be breeders. So I think that's actually what's going on in some cases.
Do you think there's some young males that opt out of this process? Or are not allowed to participate?
Could you repeat that question on the mic?
Are there some males that opt out of this process? Well, we're not really. We're still sort of unfortunately in the anecdotal stage. We think there's pretty strong evidence. Let me give you the other example. The other example was. This is just to show the development of the Gara. So here's this little sort of knob on the junior male that we tagged in 2013, and 2 years later, it had a fairly well-defined Gara, and by this time it was actually it was breeding.
I think I've got a couple more questions up here if it's not too...
Sure.
Okay.
What are the primary sources of food for these infants? Is it like minnows in the water, or how many fish are there? And how mature are the fish that
Okay.
ones eat?
Really good question. I think I'm going to answer it for you. Can you give me another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we can follow up.
Okay, one last one
Yeah.
right behind you, John.
Yeah.
So, what kind of tag is it? Like a radio tag, or is it like a video cam?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a video cam would be fun to put on one of these, I guess. They put them on sea turtles, and you can watch them eat jellyfish and stuff, but eventually maybe we'll do that. Right now, we're just putting regular radio tags, and then we're also putting GPS tags, which essentially, multiple times each day, go up to the satellites and take a fix and a reading, and then we can remotely download. Every 3 or 4 or 5 months, we can download all the records between downloading periods, and we can tell where that animal was. I'm going to show you some examples of that. And eventually, it might be possible to put some sort of visualization devices on the animals. So this was the other situation. This was a place where we had 11 nests in 2010 and 20 nests in 2011 and 30 nests in 2012. And this male with a very distinctive sort of Gara that probably was injured at one point was the main breeder and also the guardian in 2010 and 11. In 2012, he was the main breeder, but then between breeding and nesting, this male came in. They had a major series of contests, and both animals got scarred. This male disappeared, and this male stayed around, and he's the one that we featured in our image right at the beginning with all the young around. He was essentially the guardian with the maximum number of young from 28 nests that hatched, so 1,000 plus babies. But we're pretty sure that he was not the breeder of most of the animals in this nesting colony. So this is a case where one animal displaced another one and did the guarding. In this particular case, this animal is quite old, and he may be guarding in part so that he can continue to maintain his dominance as a breeder. We're not really sure. But it's very interesting that the rule seems to be a guarding male is associated with any larger group of nests. And in the cases where we have small numbers of nests, we usually end up with much higher levels of predation. Either the nests are disturbed or they're predated or both. Now, the thing that really was quite strange was last year we noted with the game cameras some instances of some 3-meter animals that looked like they were female in size sneaking in the creches, and in a couple of cases taking young. So here, this is a guarding female. These are some young. This particular young is actually not a very healthy one. He's one with a lot of yolk. He probably came from an egg that wasn't developed properly. And you'll see in the video now, this is a still, here's the video. That particular animal seemed to be singled out. We have only a few instances where these 3-meter size animals came in and selectively took hatchlings. We're not really sure what's going on. We're guessing that it may have to do with the fact that a male that's only 3 meters is still very much under heavy pressure to grow. And there isn't a lot of food during this pre-monsoon period. And so some males may attempt to come in, but usually that sort of predation episode was followed by the dominant Picara guarding male coming right in close to wherever that incident happened and making his presence known. Okay, feeding. What do the little ones do? So the females stay with the young, and that's the interesting thing about these small gharial is that they process the yolk that they hatch with. So they hatch with a belly full of yolk, but that gets processed within a week to 10 days, and they begin feeding almost immediately. And they take pretty much anything they can get in their mouth. So basically, they're taking all different kinds of fish, as long as they're small enough for them to swallow. And so if you're looking at one of these creches when the animals are 2, 3, 4 weeks old, so here's what they're feeding on. They're big fish driving small schools of minnow right into the shallows, and sitting along the shoreline are all of these fish traps. Every one of those little gharial is sitting there with its tail up against the back of the sand in the shallow water, and it's got its mouth slightly agape. And so the fish are literally just being driven right into the mouths of the waiting young. But then the monsoon comes. So in early July, all of a sudden, the monsoon comes with a vengeance. Water levels rise. They begin rising by meters. And when that happens, the adults essentially just head downstream. So they leave the young. And it's around that time when the creche, when the integrity of the creche in terms of of the animals staying together seems to wane, and the animals seem to go off on their own. What we think is happening in these situations when the water comes up very quickly is you have a lot of very shallow habitat created. And so what we think is happening is the smaller animals are actually moving laterally, and we have good evidence though that the bigger animals are moving downstream. And so the adults go down, and it turns out one of the places that acts like a magnet is the confluence of the big rivers. So this is the Chambal coming along here. This is a female near her nesting site, and then she moves down, and she moves down within a matter of just a few days. For instance, one of these animals was observed in the evening at a bridge 30 kilometers from the confluence, and the next morning she was down at the confluence. This is the Yamuna, which goes through Delhi and by the Taj and Agra and on down. It's only about the 10th the size of the Chambal. But where those two rivers come together, there's a very good feeding opportunity. So during the monsoon, there's rapid movement downstream, and primarily by the large adults, and then they hang out at the confluence while the rivers are in flood. And this is what it looks like. These rivers, they have slightly different drainages, so the Yamuna actually floods a little bit ahead of the Chambal, so they're not perfectly coincident in terms of their flooding regimes. So in this case, this is the Chambal in the distance. You can see how muddy it is, and you can see there's almost a boundary layer, right, or a boundary right here between the two rivers. So this is the Yamuna, slightly clearer and less in flood at this particular time. And what the animals are doing is essentially just moving right along this boundary layer, and they're feeding. And the fishermen know this is like really good place to fish, because the turbulence that's created where the two rivers are coming together disorients the fish and makes them a little easier to catch. And so it's possible to just, actually for the adults, this is like the adult equivalent of what we saw with the hatchlings. The adults simply congregate near the confluence, and they just are almost constantly feeding. And this is the warmest time of year. The water is high, and so probably almost easily 2/3 to 75% of their energy is probably acquired during this only 2 or 3 month period. This is a aggregation. There's very little fighting. There's very little interaction at all, other than the fact that animals are just feeding. So the large adults moved. We were fortunate that we had 3 near adult female-sized animals in the first group of 10 that we marked, and the second group, and we monitored some longer movements of roughly 100 kilometers. And then when we put the GPS tags on, we were able to get longer movements. So our big mover now is a female that's moved 210 kilometers up and down the river, and she's done this in 2015, 16, and now in 17. So this is a seasonal pattern. She just basically moves upriver, and this is where she hangs out, where eventually she breeds and nests, and then when the monsoon comes, she heads downstream, and then turns around and does the whole thing all over again the next year. This is the big male, and the male has a slightly different pattern. Just bear with me here. These are the locations, and what you'll see right away is this is sort of the dry season range. Here's the river, the Yamuna. Here's the Chambal. And that big explosion was essentially just lots and lots of locations in the same, locations on different days in the same place. So basically the animal had a very restricted range during the dry season. Then it moved down and it hung out down here during the monsoon. And then it actually went down a little bit in the combined Yamuna and Chambal. And then it turned around and it went right back up again. So the males also have well-defined patterns, but they tend to sort of head back to their familiar areas without such long distances in most cases. Okay, this is just to give some idea of what it's like moving around during the dry season, tracking some of these animals. This is we essentially go by jeep down to the river. There's some market towns and literally as I was flying in to do the catch and tagging, they announced that demonetization. All of a sudden, overnight, all the currency was not valid anymore, and none of the ATMs worked, and we had some exciting times trying to catch our animals. So we ended up, this is one of the little riverside villages, right on the river, and this was one of the trips when Gretchen went along, and so she, most of the, in the rural areas, the women are very cautious about any contact with anyone from outside, and tend to keep themselves veiled. And so here in a minute you'll just see there's the river, and one of the camels resting, and there are several generations of women that Gretchen was talking to while we were chasing. So life on the river is definitely challenging. Mustard is the main crop that's grown because it can be grown under the semi-arid conditions. Millet. And of course the river is used for pretty much everything. Everything from drinking to bathing to watering the livestock to actually a dumping ground for stuff you don't want. Okay, well, what about the smaller animals? One of the things we found early on was that these smaller animals that were 2 to 3 meters showed almost no extensive movements at all. They had really restricted ranges, home ranges. They just didn't move very far up and down the river. They didn't go down to the confluence during the monsoon. They didn't really move upriver. And we think this helps us understand a little bit about the die-off that happened. Some vets came in, they did some autopsies, but it was never really possible to find out what killed the animals. The conventional explanation was that it was pollution from the Yamuna. But the problem is that the Yamuna is chronically polluted. It wasn't just polluted during this 2007 and 8 period, it's pretty much polluted most of the time. And this is the pattern of the die-offs. The die-offs all occurred about 50 or 60 kilometers upstream from the confluence. And these animals, if they behaved like the animals that we tagged, were not actually moving down to the confluence. So they probably weren't necessarily becoming exposed directly to the toxins. So what we think was happening was some sort of local spill. The subadults are definitely sedentary. And the thing about the die-off was it was very specific to gharial. It didn't affect anything else. None of the turtles, none of the other aquatic birds that ate fish. It didn't affect the bugger. It happened very quickly, within about 4 or 5 weeks. And it was very restricted in terms of its geographic location. So whatever it was may have been some sort of local toxin spill. We just simply don't know. Okay, so this is one of the other things that we've been able to do is to sort of work out within the year what the animals are doing at different times. And you can also appreciate if you're going to do a survey, one of the best times to do it is in February when the animals are out basking, so it's easy to count the animals. But if some of the animals that you're counting have moved up the river, and others have actually been living on the river in the same place, then it's important to know a little bit more about what individual animals are doing and what the different life stages are doing in order to interpret what you go out and see. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about what the animals are doing the rest of the year. So these are some males, and the only reason to show this is just simply you can see the development of this gara. Here's an animal with a little tiny nubbin. Here's an animal with a slightly larger knob, about half developed, similar to the one we saw in the animal we tagged, and then here's an animal with almost a full gara. So the gara seems to develop on animals as they get larger, and there's quite a bit of variation in the size and how it relates to the animals. But you do see these big gara males happily side by side without any evidence of fighting at this particular time. But then the animals begin to display, the males then do display, and dominant male begins to establish his dominance for breeding. And these are some sequences that we just shot this last February, and we had a couple of instances where we had several males that were nearly the same size contesting for dominance in this particular area. And you can see they're not really dueling with their snouts. What they're trying to do is lift their head up high enough, but there is actually a little bit of biting going on, because you can see the garas are actually getting quite scarred. This animal has actually lost a lot of the skin on his snout, and his gara is also punctured with tooth marks. But what they're actually doing is trying to essentially lift their head high enough so that they can get on the back of the other animal, and then they ride each other, and presumably that's an indication of how big you are, and then the biggest one eventually ends up being the dominant animal in that area. This can go on for 2 or 3 hours. These are two animals the year before, just taking a break in between one of these contests. And I have a student now who's just begun to do some work. One of the things that the gharial do is make a sound that we were calling a jaw clap, but it's actually probably more accurately called a popping sound. I'm not sure this is going to play.
So in this particular example, we actually...
Well, anyway, let me go back.
So in this particular example, we actually...
Well, I'll just briefly describe what we found. We're just at the initial stages, but what happens here is the animal actually submerges underwater and produces a popping sound, but it's actually not moving its jaws because there'd be a lot of water disturbance associated with that. And ahead of that is actually an infrasound component, because in this particular case we had 2 or 3 spoonbills that were standing in the water nearby, and all of a sudden the spoonbills, from resting with their beak in their back posture, woke up and suddenly come to attention, and then a fraction of a second later you can actually hear the sound produced. So there's an infrasound component. The sound is produced underwater, but it's not produced by snapping the jaws. It's produced probably by somehow pushing air through different chambers in the respiratory system. It's just been discovered recently that crocodilians actually breathe like birds. They have a one-way airflow system, which is typical of birds and was always thought to be associated with very high energy and maximum oxygen extraction. But in crocodilians, it's probably actually related to something like diving and being able to spend hours underwater in a situation where you're not necessarily using huge amounts of oxygen like birds. Anyway, these are some shots of the male displaying. So the male displays in his breeding area. He usually excludes other males, which are on the periphery, and he the displays are characterized by this heavy breathing, again through the gara, and females that are receptive approach the male, and then they court and mate. The subdominant males, the marginal males, usually approach the females, and the females really don't want to have anything to do with them. So the breeding all happens probably in these breeding arenas that dominant males set up. But we think the pattern is actually quite complicated, and it may actually be the females that are deciding who to breed with, and they're probably actually maybe visiting more than one of these breeding areas in a season. There's a lot of evidence in most of the other crocodilians of multiple paternity within a clutch, so that means all the clutches aren't necessarily full siblings, and that may well be happening in Gharial as well. So most of the action happens underwater, but there you can see the male. They're in probably water that's a meter and a half deep. And this takes 10, 15 minutes. So this is a pattern of movement by one of the females. One of the females we had marked with the GPS unit. And what we found was the first year, 2015, the female didn't nest, but she hung out near the nesting areas. And then the second year, she actually had a breeding area, which you can see here. And then eventually she moved from the breeding area down to a nesting area where she eventually laid her nest. So the GPS loggers give us much finer scale daily movement of the animals, and that in combination with the manual tracking that we're doing, it's sort of a way we can ground truth the manual tracking. And in most cases, there's a pretty good agreement between the spatial patterns that we get from those two systems. Okay. So then nesting begins. The females dig these nests. These are trial nests. And you notice they're not up on the top of the high sand. So they love high sandbanks. So this is 15 to 20 feet from the water line, and the water line will continue to recede. And then there's deep water usually at the base of these nesting sites. So one of the advantages of putting your nest 2/3 of the way up is it's really hard for the predators to get down and steal the eggs. And as a guardian or a protector, you can also keep track of what's going on during the incubation period. The nest is the nesting sites are very dynamic along the river, so they occur. Typically they're big monsoons, and then there are nesting areas for a number of years, and then the whole system shifts locally. So. And one of the things we're beginning to do in addition to the study of communication among the male gharial. So this popping sound that I mentioned, actually the males produce that, and they sort of talk to each other essentially over about half a kilometer from one end of the sandbank to the other. And if one animal produces these sounds, the other animal will respond. And what we don't know though is how the adults are communicating with each other, the males with the females, and also with the young. So one of the things we want to do is look in more detail at that at the creches. And also with the eggshell material, we can essentially identify the hatchlings as individuals, and we can also get a marker for the female. And then we simply have to sample some of the males to work out how genetically how the animals are related to one another, to pin down some of the unknowns associated with things like the alloparental care. And then intriguingly, we find that when the animals are like 9 months, so this animal is about 9 months old, and the next nesting season is beginning. And some of these animals, there are not many of them because there is a very high mortality rate, but these smaller animals like to hang out near some of the big adults. And the big adults actually will display to them, and which is very intriguing. And so there's some hint that there's some interaction between these animals even a year after they're hatched. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is keep track of what some of the major threats are. Right now, the main threat to gharial on this river system is sand mining. So in India now, there's a major development boom. There's a lot of building, and they're literally just taking sand out of these rivers for making mortar. This particular kind of sand is probably close to the sort of mechanically ground sand associated with the Les Hills, for instance, in western Iowa, where you have these vertical cliffs, but it's essentially sand and clay. That's sort of a similar kind of material. So this Champal sand is highly valued because it's really good for making mortar because it keeps the bricks together, apparently. So there's a lot of pressure for sand mining. And then there are continual threats, as you can imagine. This is essentially a clean river. Nobody really can believe that. If you've gone to Bombay or Delhi or any of the major cities in India, you really don't think about consuming anything from any of the waterways that are visible. But the people that are living along these rivers, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of them, are taking their water. The guys that are working with me doing the tracking are drinking Champal water. There's sort of a certain kind of a tough guy attitude associated with it. So if you want to threaten someone, you can kind of say, well, don't mess around with me because I drink the Champal. But it is potable water, and the livestock are totally dependent on it, and as well as for irrigation. So there's a major threat in terms of water extraction, water coming out of the river. The dams are always a problem, but so far there haven't been any dams built on the Champal other than in the very upper stretches. So these are just some shots of what it looks like. This is the Ravine country. You're never very far from people, but in some ways, for studying an animal as secretive and as hard to study as a crocodilian, in some ways that's sort of a asset because the animals are really used to people, and as long as you don't do anything really different. So, for instance, when we go down and turn on our telemetry equipment and sort of start speaking loudly in English, then sometimes we think the animals actually can tell the difference between when there's a different presence on the river. They're incredibly used to sort of the usual day-to-day activities, and when there are large groups that move up and down the river, the animals react very differently. So these are just some more shots. Sand mining by camel has been occurring for probably a long time. You can see here, this is the other side of the river, and this is an area where the sand has been removed. We're also involved in some community programs. This is one of the locals from across the river, and these are a whole bunch of babies, and he came over and basically said, why did you let all these animals go on our river? We don't want these gharial in our river. We're out fishing, we're catching fish. We don't want these gharial, they're going to eat all our fish. And yet this was in his backyard. And so there are a number of programs. The Forest Department sometimes takes the lead. This is one of the Forest Department guys who is also leading these community programs that are sort of environmentally focused. This is a little group of villagers. And one of the things is the kids do these plays where different kids take different roles. So this is a turtle, and this is a gharial, and here's a shepherd, and there's a bird. And the bird is saying, don't cut down all the trees, leave some place for me to nest. And the turtle's saying, don't leave too many nets in the water. And the gharial's saying, don't take all the sand, etc. So we do capacity building programs for the Forest Department. And this is the fellow who's done most of the hard work, Pankaj. And the work we've been doing is through the Madras Crocodile Bank. So Ron Whitaker has been a colleague and friend for 30 plus years. We worked in South India earlier at the Crocodile Bank. This is the small team of trackers. We've got a couple of trackers, a guy that does most of our driving and helps us with the base organization. Pankaj was the one who really observed the male involvement early on and pointed this out, and was instrumental and has been the main tracker and naturalist researcher on the project, year in and year out. Here he is. His father grew up on the river and was a boatman. And this is our cook tracker, and the guy who does the community programs for us, one of the local forest guards. And this is one of the older headmen in the village where we stay. We stay in a rented building, just sort of in the middle of town. It's a little village of maybe 1,600 people. This is the building, and we have a shade area on the roof, and that's where we pitch our tents and hang out some of the time. Pretty basic. Mostly vegetarian, but the occasional fish and chicken have been consumed as well. Here's some egg curry.
Oh, perfect.
And this is 10 minutes from our base, so we were actually able to make lots of observations early on. Those are gharial on the opposite side of the river, and this was a nesting area for a number of years. Okay, I better stop there. I'm way over time. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I do have some questions, so raise your hand if you've got something you want to ask. I'm going to head up this way first, okay? All right, start back here.
How long do gharial normally live?
We don't know. We think probably they have a lifespan that probably approximates that of people. So probably these big gharial males are probably not really breeding until they're 15 or 20 at the earliest. And the females probably mature maybe about 15 years, but then they may well reproduce for 15, 20, or even 25 years beyond that. So they're long-lived. And when you think about the actual population dynamics, the two animals really just have to replace themselves. So this huge production of young is just sort of a gamble every year. And some years are good years, and some years aren't. That's one of the major differences between these long-lived reptiles and things like birds and mammals, which produce fewer young, but consistently do it in a regular pattern. They're probably really good years for gharial, and they're probably not such good years. This species does have their egg temperature determines their sex. But one of the really tricky things about gharial is that they're incredibly difficult to sex. So, and and sometimes I actually wonder whether the sex might be more labile than it is in some of the other crocodilian species. I mean, weird things happen, and it's possible. But they're very difficult to sex when they're small, whereas most of the other alligators and crocodiles you can sex in tennis shoes.
Great. Let's see, I'm gonna kind of work my way down, okay? So right over here.
What's their dominant sense and how do they perceive the world?
Well, good question. Their lifestyle is, they're essentially a water's edge predator. They have an incredible visual acuity, so they can see really well, we think. They can see color. One of the weird things, or one of the things you probably noticed, is the strange posture. They all have their snouts up at this sort of almost like 45-degree angle. No one's actually done a detailed study, but what I suspect is happening is if you have a really long snout like that, if you keep your snout horizontal, you really can't see beyond your snout. If you're trying to look at the waters on the horizon. So I think by simply lifting the head, that they end up having some stereo vision or some visual acuity. So vision's important. On the pit of every scale, especially around the head, they have what are called integumentary sensory organs. It's sort of like a do everything in a little sensory organ. It's mechanical. It has, I think, some electrical properties, and these things are concentrated in the areas where the animal, like in the head, where the animal is actually moving its head in order to catch fish. Hearing is fairly good. We think probably that they're communicating in this infrasound region, which is 2 to 20 hertz, or very, very low frequency. This is the sort of thing you see when they show pictures of alligators bellowing, or if you've been down in Florida and you stood on a walkway in a place where alligators are bellowing, you could feel the vibrations. And so that's actually what those spoonbills were sensing apparently before the actual sound that we could actually hear. So, so they have multiple, a number of sensory systems that are particularly adapted. And then the main thing is that, like for instance with the respiration, is that they can remain stationary, for unbelievably long periods of time. And energetically, they're very, very efficient because, like these big animals probably really only have to eat a few months of the year, if that, and then they can probably even coast through a couple of years if there was some catastrophe. So.
Excellent. I'm just working my way down the road here. So question right here, and then you guys keep your hands down. I'll get you next, okay?
I have 2 questions. One, how long can a crocodile live without water? And the other is the males that die quickly, the 3-kilometer males who use a toxin, they have had small babies around them, small ones that died at the same time?
No, okay, let me answer the last question. The last part of your question. The really strange thing is that only the animals in this 2 to 4 meter size category were the ones that died during the die-off. There weren't any small animals that died, and there weren't any really big animals, and very few adults actually. They were mostly subadults. And they're eating different kinds of things, and what we really don't know, what we think might have happened is some sublethal effect of some toxin, maybe incapacitated some fish. There wasn't a big fish kill-off. There have been in other times. In several other species of crocodiles, there are algal blooms that have been associated with die-offs. There are toxins that are produced by blue-green algae, I think, and there have been die-offs related to that. That doesn't seem to be the case in the Gharial. And what was the first part?
That's what I was wondering, how long they can live without water.
Okay, well, Gharial are almost one of the most aquatic species. It's the one crocodilian, living crocodilian that can't get up and walk on its limbs. It doesn't do this sort of everyone's probably seen this video of this alligator walking across a path down in Florida. Right? So it looks more like a dinosaur because it lifts itself so its belly's completely off the ground, like by a foot or 18 inches. Gharial are sort of sliding like seals. They basically really can't get up and move around with their limbs. But they have incredibly strong neck muscles that sort of make up in part for the fact that they're not able to get up and move around. So they're very aquatic. Some species of crocodiles, like the Australian freshwater crocodile and the mugger, the one that actually lives in many of the freshwater habitats. The mugger's kind of like an Asiatic alligator in a way. It's about the same size. They're probably a lot meaner, but they actually can kind of check out and almost aestivate. So they make in Sri Lanka, they make tunnels, and during the hot time of year, they actually go down and stay underground in tunnels for a period of time. When they don't feed, maybe there's a little bit of water. Most crocodilians will dry out pretty fast if they don't have any access to water. But the big problem they have during part of the year is heat. And so in tropical species, you find they do a lot of heat avoidance. There's always a focus on the fact that alligators are out basking in the sun, so the idea is that animals are always wanting to get warm. But there's a cost to getting warm. When you get warm, your metabolism goes up exponentially. So it really costs you a lot in terms of energy at the high end if you're hot. So one of the ways you can conserve energy is to stay cool. So one of the things that these animals do during the hot time of year is submerge. And so the Gharial actually during May and June, and it's like 45, 50 degrees centigrade. So it's 120 to 130 degrees during this time when the babies are hatching. So we only get up early in the morning and we're out at 5 and we're back by 8 or 9 o'clock. And everybody's checked out from noon to 4 o'clock. It's just too hot. You can't do anything. And we're drinking like 7, 8, 9 liters of water a day just to stay hydrated. So the Gharial probably are not living without water for very long, but some crocodilians can manage for a little while.
Okay, we've got another 2 questions over here. I'm going to hand the mic to you.
Why do they have those thingies on their snouts?
What, this?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I don't know. Hopefully we can find out. So what we think is, we don't know how the sound is produced. So what we need to do is get together with somebody who's a respiratory expert like this. There's a woman in Utah who's actually really studied in detail airflow. So what happens in crocodilians is they have a whole bunch of chambers, kind of like in birds, and the air comes in, it goes into the back, it's in these chambers, and then it gets pushed through across the oxygen exchange system, and then out. It doesn't, come in and then go out again like in birds and mammals. It's sort of typical bird or mammalian lung structure. It's a very unique structure, and so what we think is that maybe this Gara has to do with helping produce this sound. It's not very impressive, I guess, and we have trouble with the sound because it's kind of a buzzing sound. But I guess if you're a Gharial, you can hear it, and it's important.
I have 2 questions. Number 1, do you know how fast their heartbeat can beat?
No, I don't know offhand. Good question. It probably varies a lot with temperature.
is there a way to tell the sex of right after they're like when they're like little? Is there a way?
No, you can't.
Okay, one last one.
Do the babies have the gargles?
No, only the big males.
Why?
Well, we don't know.
Okay, we got a question right there.
I was just curious, how big are the eggs?
Something like that. They're about 100. So like an alligator egg might be 70 or 80 grams. So but a gargoyle egg is going to be about 2 or 3 times that, like a huge goose egg probably. And they lay about 35 to 45, sometimes 50 eggs. And then see, they nest all kind of close together, so not right on top of each other, but within basically a body length or 2. And so there's this huge advantage. So what we think is happening is this colonial nesting is sort of the key to the whole thing. The females are basically, calling all the shots. They're basically deciding where the best place to nest is, who they're going to mate with, and then where they're going to nest. So we think that these nesting sites are probably made up of offspring that have been parented by males from a number of these different breeding places. And so somehow these junior males are getting sort of recruited to help guard the babies, in part because maybe they're going to benefit eventually from breeding opportunities with some of those nesting females.
Great. I think we'll have to wrap it up there and give just a little bit of time before possibly the next rehearsal comes in at 9 o'clock. So thank you very much, Dr. Lang for being here. Thank you all for joining us today. And I really hope to see you for our May installment before the summer comes around. Check us out on the website if you have any questions. Thank you again. Bye.
Thank you.
So, I'm going there. I don't know when, but I think that's when you'll see all the birds. Well, the reason they honestly, all of them want is we went to time like that in the dry season. And I just was in Peru 2 months ago for the wet season. I would so much rather work in the dry season. So, when the dry season is basically December through February,
Right. The best time to go, from it depends on what you're after.
Okay.
This jumbo area is there's an occasional Russell Stark.
oh, I know you're sure. My brother's very much asleep. Okay, I told that joke way too much. Sorry. Yeah, I hear you.